The US midterm elections have just taken place with early results showing a still divided America. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives and a third of the 100 seats in the Senate are up for election. And if the president and his party lose control of the Senate and the House, they're unlikely to be able to pass any laws. Should New Zealanders be concerned? Massey University sociologist Professor Paul Spoonley, who is co-director of the newly established Centre of Research Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, is with us now. Tēnā koe, Professor Spoonley. Thank you for joining us.
Kia ora, Neil.
Now, it's unlikely, or rather it's likely, to take some time for the outcome of these midterm elections. Why do American politics, especially with an oversized Republican influence, potentially threaten our security?
Well, it's the biggest and most powerful country in the world, and where America goes, we tend to go. And of course, the issue is that it appears that the Congress will certainly be Republican, but the Senate might well be pretty much 50-50. But with a Congress that is primarily Republican, then they will essentially inhibit whatever the president wants to do. And the issue for us is that, of course, under Biden, there's been a return to multilateralism. And on issues like climate change or the war in Ukraine, we've seen a much more inclusive America, whereas under a Republican-dominated Congress, then we would see a much more America-first foreign policy.
Professor Spoonley, one of your books coming out early next year, I believe, called Histories of Hate, about how QAnon and the racist right fed by Trump have influenced New Zealand events, including the parliamentary protests earlier this year. What does this racist right believe, and how concerning is this for us?
Well, as in the United States, that racist right got a real boost through the pandemic because people were naturally anxious. But what they then did was that some of those politics, particularly the anti-immigrant politics, but also the belief that America was woke. So woke is one of those terms that was used by African Americans to indicate an awareness of racial injustice, and now is being flipped around by the conservative and far right to say, well, you know, people are being too sensitive about these sorts of issues. And so they've arrived here, and underlying this sort of broad anti-diversity politics is, of course, beliefs in conspiracies, particularly concerning Muslims, Jews, the UN. So it in one sense, it feels relatively benign on the surface, but when you get underneath it, it is deeply concerning because it has these really hostile, vitriolic views about minorities.
And how has this group been able to gain any kind of political traction here in Aotearoa?
Yeah, well, Neil, this is really quite peculiar. And if you looked at those parliamentary protests earlier in the year, what was puzzling to me was the arrival of American flags, the Confederate flag, a whole lot of Trump stuff, and the belief, for example, of the sovereign citizens movement in New Zealand and the right of sheriffs to set down the law and to arrest people from the Prime Minister down. So we've seen, it's been one of those moments when suddenly what happens in the United States, particularly given QAnon and the other conspiratorial views that have come out of there, have had a huge impact here. And it's really surprised me at the depth of that impact.
Now, we're a year out from our general election. We've heard of escalating anger and threats of violence towards politicians in general, and targeted campaigns to infiltrate local government to try to upset our country and make it ungovernable, if you like. Is this possible, and what else could we see in the coming months?
Well, it's a real concern, and it should be a concern. So some groups like the Voices for Freedom tried to destabilise the local body elections, didn't succeed. However, the very low turnout probably doesn't give a good indication of what is possible. So the general election next year will be the moment in which we see these politics beginning to re-emerge. So those parliamentary protests that we saw earlier this year had a range of views that were often hostile to politicians, often hostile to government. And when the election comes around next year, are we going to see those views manifest again? So I could imagine, for example, major political parties, political leaders turning up to somewhere to speak, and you and I going along to hear them, but then a group that feels that they have been let down, that they want to prosecute politicians, that they want to disrupt our political elections and undermine our political values, could easily disrupt our election campaigns and make it very, very difficult. So, if we want to go along and hear the leader, the prime minister or the leader of the opposition, do you have to go through security to get into the room, which is what's been happening, by the way. And so I just think it's one of those moments which is going to test our political system.
And we've all come across people, Kiwis, who I think are well-meaning in the main, who have been drawn into this type of narrative and feel that they're right. What do we need to do to ensure that people are listening to the right narratives?
Yeah, well, there's a real issue, and I think all of us have seen family members who've gone down those rabbit holes. It's very difficult to have a conversation with them. My advice at that personal level is to keep the lines of communication open, but then to avoid the issues like the pandemic or perhaps politics, to try and, because you're never going to win over. In my experience, facts, particularly facts that have been established in the media, for example, just don't convince these people. The second thing is a real concern. So, Neil, you and the others in the media are doing a pretty good job, but unfortunately, the people we're talking about don't trust you and they don't actually watch the media. And so they've got their own alternative media sources, tended to be online. And that is a very big concern for us politically, because if we don't come on and talk to Neil Walker and these sorts of occasions, we're not talking to one another. We've sort of split the community, and people are really down their own rabbit holes, in this case, in terms of the anti-vax, anti-mandate, anti-government movement, and are not prepared to engage in mass media, which I'm not sure how we get around that, to be honest.
Okay. Now, we hear that Donald Trump obviously is expected to announce that he will run for president in 2024 if he doesn't end up incarcerated. How concerned should we be sitting on the other side of the world?
I think we should be very, very concerned. I think some of his wind's been taken out of his sails. It wasn't the red wave, the Republican wave that he was expecting. And in fact, the Democrats have actually done quite well, particularly in the Senate, where one of Trump's key candidates, Dr. Oz, was actually defeated. But it's really that tendency to mandate, to encourage difference and division, and to be disrespectful of people. I mean, I don't have to agree with the guy, but I do want him to engage in a publicly respectful conversation about issues that matter, and he doesn't. So, I mean, it's a very interesting test of American democracy and of the Republican Party. I suspect there are a big chunk of the Republicans who are very pro-Trump, but another group who are not. So, does Trump and do those pro-Trump political supporters get to have their say? And we'll find out in the next couple of weeks.
As always, enjoy speaking with you, Massey University sociologist Professor Paul Spoonley. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ngā mihi.
Kia ora, Neil.